So as required by the statute, the framework for evaluating teachers has two major components. Half of the evaluation comes from what we refer to as the practice component. You might think of that as the professional work the teacher does to do the teaching. It includes the classroom teaching, but it also includes things like planning for instruction, assessing student learning, diagnosing student difficulties, planning to remediate. All of that is the practice component. It's what the teacher is doing. The other 50% of the framework for evaluating teachers is the product of teaching. That is what students learn. And that was what was required by the statute. So the details of how we develop these recommendations are that beginning in the year 2015-16, 50% of the teacher's evaluation will come from data based on systematic observations of the teacher's work with students in the classroom. These systematic observations will be done using a tool that is a checklist that guides the principal, or in some cases a qualified peer, I'll explain that in a moment, to observe a lesson or a portion of a lesson using this checklist to note the features of the teaching. What's crucial about this is that under current practice in many districts, not only in Michigan but nationally, principals or others who observe teachers go into the classroom and sit like many of you are sitting right now, make a few notes on a piece of paper based on what that individual happens to pay attention to, and use that as the data. You can understand why, from many perspectives, that's not desirable. First, the person observing, then it's highly dependent on their personal preferences. And from one observation to the next, one might be observing entirely different things. From one classroom to the next, one might be observing different things, and certainly from one school to the next. A second reason that this is problematic is that this puts us in a very vulnerable position for teachers or others being evaluated to say, on what basis was the person paying attention to that and not this? Why were they commenting on the boy who answered that question and not noticing how well the small groups worked? Why did they not notice how clear my explanation was and instead commented on the messiness of my closet? And teachers have told us that it was exactly that variable when principals didn't have useful tools to guide the observations. What they observed was highly variable and capricious. So a central part of our recommendation is to recommend that the state adopt a tool, and we've recommended 4 tools, of which we expect the state to select one. The reason we recommended 4 is because based on our results of the pilot work, the study we were able to conduct in 13 districts, what we concluded is that any of these 4 tools would be a substantial, significant, and dramatic improvement over current practice. And what we like about being able to recommend this is that it puts the state in a very smart financial position by being able to get bids from the vendors and be able to select a tool that is most efficient for what the resources are that we want to put to this. Because what the vendors will have to provide is not only the tool itself, but very importantly, the training for those who will use the tool. And I cannot overemphasize how important training is. Simply getting a checklist and being sent to a classroom to observe will not get us there. And what we learned from the pilot study is that training is absolutely fundamental. The vendors provide it. This will put the state in the position of issuing a request for proposals to supply the tools to Michigan, and we will be able to be in a position to do the best possible deal. We might have discovered that one of these tools was much better than the other 3. That was not the finding of our pilot study. So this is one example of many of what we were able to gain by being able to conduct a study rather than just thinking and then coming back to you with our best guesses. We allow, and I'll show you a little more detail about this, local districts to be able, so we require that of the 50%, there'll be a lot of percentages in my presentation, so it's good that we warmed up with some math. Of the 50% that's dedicated to professional practice, the left-hand side of the screen, 80% of that, or 40% of the entire evaluation, must come from the use of the tool and observation of teaching. That means that a district could opt to use some other evidence for the remaining 20% of the 50%, such as parental views, student views, professional engagements of the teacher. A district may do that. A district is not required to do that. And this gives me an opportunity to point out to you that we were very careful about the verbs that we used. Some of our recommendations say that certain things must be done. Some are things where we encourage because we've learned that they're good practice, but we didn't recommend requiring them. There are other things that we discouraged because we learned that they are likely to interfere with the goals of our system that we're recommending, and some things we prohibit. So in this case, we require that 80% of the 50% come from the use of tool-guided observations of teaching practice, and we permit that 20% of the 50% could come from other sources. But a district could choose to just have all of the professional practice come from the observations. We also learned, and this was one of the examples where we had to balance feasibility with what would be best. You can understand what I'm about to say, that the more times you observe a teacher, the more reliable are your estimates of the skill of that teacher. Imagine showing up in my classroom on a day that many of my students are out of sorts, several aren't feeling well, and perhaps some are absent. Perhaps I have a very bad lesson on that day, and you decide from that that I'm really unskillful as a teacher. But were you to come back the next day or the next week, you see a lesson that makes you very impressed. You don't want that kind of unreliability in the system, and you get more and more reliable estimates the more observations one has. So we might have recommended that there be for every teacher, let's say 5 or 6 observations per year, and scientifically that would have produced greater reliability, but that would be entirely unfeasible. Imagine requiring districts to produce for every teacher 6 observations per year. So the recommendations say multiple, which obviously means 2 or more, and more are better. In the service of this, for a couple of reasons, we do also allow, although not require, we allow but not require, that qualified peers could conduct some of the observations. They wouldn't conduct the evaluation, but they could produce some of the observational data. A qualified peer would be somebody who has received professional ratings 3 in a row and is an expert in some aspect of that teacher's work. For example, if you were a high school physics teacher, you might very well appreciate having at least one of the observations conducted by someone who knows physics, where your high school principal might be somebody who was in fact an elementary reading teacher. So that's the reason why you might actually appreciate that. Or if you're a special education teacher, it might be useful to have at least one observation conducted by someone with experience in special education. But again, we didn't require this, but allowed it. And we do, of course, require that the principal conduct at least one of the multiple. Another reason for allowing qualified peers is that it might give districts an opportunity to provide more data on teachers rather than less, which would increase the reliability of the estimates. People in intermediate school districts, for example, could be participating in this. And again, these are all things that districts could do. They're not required by our recommendations. What's required is that of the 50% of the practice score, 80% of that must come from observations guided with a specified tool, not a locally grown tool.